The soil of modern France has held human footprints for thousands of years. But history, the kind written down, argued over, and remembered, begins at the edge of the Iron Age. Roman sources speak of three peoples dividing this land among themselves: the Aquitani in the southwest, the Belgae in the north, and between them, the Gauls. The Gauls were Celts, migrants who had pushed westward from Central Europe sometime in the 6th or 5th century BC, bringing with them iron tools, tribal gods, and a stubborn resistance to anyone who tried to tell them what to do. They would need that stubbornness. Because Rome was watching, in 122 BC, the Roman Republic reached across the Alps. Southern France fell first, reorganized into a province called Gallia Narbonensis, Gaul of the Narbonne. The Romans built roads, founded cities, and began the slow work of turning a Celtic frontier into something familiar. Then came Caesar. Between 58 and 50 BC, Julius Caesar launched a series of campaigns that would define his career and devastate a continent. He crossed rivers, burned villages, besieged fortresses, and by the time it was over, all of Gaul was Roman. The Celts didn't disappear, they adapted. Their culture blended with Rome's until something new emerged: Gallo-Roman civilization. Latin replaced the old tongues. Roman gods stood beside Celtic ones. The province didn't just submit to Rome. It became Rome, but Rome itself was dying. In the 4th century, the Huns swept out of the Eurasian steppe and pressed against the northern shores of the Black Sea. The pressure they created sent shockwaves across Europe. Germanic peoples, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Franks, Vandals, Burgundians, Lombards, lurched westward in what historians would later call the migration period. Some pushed into Spain, some crossed into North Africa, others poured through the cracks in Rome's frontier. The Western Roman Empire, already hollowed out by corruption and overextension, could not hold. In 476 AD, it collapsed. Into that vacuum stepped a Frankish chieftain named Clovis. He was ruthless, calculating, and unusually gifted at outlasting his enemies. In 486, he defeated the last Roman governor of Gaul and founded the Merovingian dynasty. He united the central and northern territories under his rule. Then he made a strategic decision that would shape European history for 1,000 years. He converted to Christianity. With the church behind him, Clovis had legitimacy that no amount of battlefield victories alone could provide. His kingdom survived him, though not intact. Frankish tradition divided inheritance among sons, and the Merovingian realm fractured, reunited, and fractured again across the generations. By the 8th century, real power had quietly shifted. The kings still wore crowns, but it was their palace mayors, the mayors of the palace, who actually governed. One of those mayors changed the world: Charles Martel. His name means the hammer. In 732, an Islamic army that had swept through the Iberian Peninsula and pushed deep into Frankish territory met him near Poitiers. What happened over the following days became one of the most debated battles in Western history. The Muslim advance halted. Whether it was a decisive defeat or a strategic withdrawal remains contested by historians. What is certain is this: it didn't go further. Martel's son, Pepin the Short, converted that military prestige into royal title. In 751, he deposed the last Merovingian king, a symbolic figure who had been ruling in name only, and declared himself king of the Franks. The Carolingian dynasty had begun. Its greatest moment came in 768, when Pepin's son took the throne, Charlemagne, Charles the Great. In the span of a single reign, he conquered half of Europe: modern France, Germany, the Low Countries, northern Italy, parts of Spain. He built schools. He standardized weights and measures. He filled the administrative void that Rome's collapse had created. On Christmas Day, 800 AD, Pope Leo XIII placed a crown on his head in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome and called him emperor. It was a remarkable moment. The idea of a Western Roman emperor, dead for more than 3 centuries, had been resurrected. Not in Rome, but in a Frankish chapel. It lasted less than a generation after his death. The empire was divided among his grandsons by the Treaty of Verdun in 843. The western portion, roughly corresponding to modern France, went to Charles the Bald. This was the embryo from which France would eventually grow. The 9th and 10th centuries were dangerous ones for the Western Franks. From the north came the Vikings. They sailed up the Seine. They sacked monasteries. They returned year after year, and no Frankish king seemed capable of stopping them. Eventually, the solution was diplomatic rather than military. A Viking chieftain named Rollo was granted a region in the northwest on the condition that he defended against further raids. His people converted to Christianity, learned French, and became the Normans. In 987, the last Carolingian king died without an heir. The French nobles elected Hugh Capet as king. It was not an obvious choice. He controlled only a modest territory around Paris. But his dynasty would rule France, in one form or another, for 8 centuries. The realm gradually ceased to be called Francia and became known as France. Medieval France was not a unified state in any modern sense. The king's authority stopped at the borders of his personal lands. Beyond that, powerful dukes and counts operated with near total independence. The Duke of Normandy was, in many respects, stronger than the King of France, a fact that became embarrassingly clear in 1066, when William of Normandy crossed the English Channel and conquered England at the Battle of Hastings. The Norman duke now ruled a kingdom larger than France itself. For the next 3 centuries, French kings patiently, methodically expanded their power. They made alliances with the church. They acquired territories through marriage, inheritance, and conquest. The Capetian kings of the 12th and 13th centuries sent crusading armies to the Holy Land, both out of genuine piety and shrewd political calculation. Nothing built royal prestige like being seen as the defender of Christendom. Then, in 1328, Charles V died without a son. It seems like a simple dynastic problem. It was not. The Valois cousin who took the throne, Philip VI, was challenged almost immediately by King Edward III of England, who claimed the French crown through his mother. The legal argument was complex. The consequences were not. In 1337, England and France went to war. They would remain at war, with intervals of uneasy peace, for the next 116 years. The 100 Years' War was not a single sustained conflict. It was a series of campaigns, truces, betrayals, and catastrophes. English archers devastated French knights at Crécy and Agincourt. The Black Death killed a third of the population, while armies still maneuvered across the landscape. English forces came close to permanently splitting the French kingdom. Then, in 1429, a teenage girl from Lorraine arrived at the court of the uncrowned French Dauphin and told him she had been sent by God. Joan of Arc's military contribution was real but limited. Her symbolic impact was enormous. She gave the French cause a momentum it hadn't possessed in decades. The English were eventually expelled from all French territory except Calais. The war ended in 1453. France emerged from it not just intact, but transformed, more centralized, more militarized, more conscious of itself as a nation. The 15th century's end brought a new ambition, expansion into Italy. French kings looked south and saw fragmented Italian city-states, wealthy and militarily weak. The Italian Wars began in 1494 and lasted for decades. But France quickly found itself blocked, not by the Italians, but by the Habsburgs. The House of Habsburg, through a series of dynastic marriages of almost mathematical precision, had assembled the most powerful empire in Europe. Charles V was simultaneously Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain, and ruler of the Low Countries. France was surrounded. The response was characteristically French, pragmatic, and shocking to contemporaries. King Francis I allied with the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent against the Catholic Habsburg Emperor, Christian king and Muslim sultan, coordinating military strategy against a common enemy. The Pope was appalled. It worked anyway. Within France, a different war was brewing. John Calvin, a French theologian working from Geneva, had developed a systematic Protestant theology that spread rapidly through the French-educated classes. By 1562, religious tension had become armed conflict. The French wars of religion lasted 36 years. They were not simply a theological dispute. They were a political crisis, a social collapse, and a humanitarian catastrophe simultaneously. Millions died not just in battle but from famine and disease. Entire towns changed hands and changed confessions and changed hands again. The worst single moment came in August 1572. On St. Bartholomew's Day, Catholic mobs massacred thousands of Protestant Huguenots across France. The exact death toll is unknown. The psychological scar never fully healed. The wars ended not with a theological settlement, but with a political compromise. Henry V of the Bourbon dynasty converted from Protestantism to Catholicism to secure the throne, reportedly remarking that Paris was worth a mass. Then he issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598, granting Protestants significant rights. It was an early, imperfect experiment in religious tolerance. The 17th century belonged to one man. Louis XIV came to the throne in 1643 at the age of 4. He would reign for 72 years, the longest reign of any major European monarch in history. He called himself the Sun King, and in his mind, France orbited around him. He built Versailles, not just as a palace, but as a political instrument, a place where he could keep the potentially rebellious nobility entertained, watched, and dependent on royal favor. He waged war constantly, pushing France's borders in every direction. For 50 years, no European power could match France militarily, but wars cost money, and Louis fought too many of them for too long. By the time he died in 1715, France's treasury was empty, its population exhausted, and its rivals, Britain and Prussia especially, had grown stronger. The debts he left behind would compound across the 18th century into something unmanageable. Britain was the particular problem. The two powers clashed repeatedly across the 18th century. In Europe, in the Americas, in India, on the oceans. The 7 Years' War, fought between 1756 and 1763, was, in many respects, the first true world war. Britain and France fought on 5 continents. When it ended, France had lost Canada, most of its Indian territories, and its position as the dominant colonial power. The humiliation was profound. France took its revenge by supporting the American colonists in their revolution against Britain, funding, supplying, and eventually fighting alongside them. The strategy succeeded. Britain lost America. France gained nothing tangible and spent money it didn't have. By 1789, France was bankrupt, hungry, and furious. The Enlightenment had spent a century teaching educated Europeans to question everything: the authority of kings, the privileges of nobility, the structure of society itself. In France, those ideas collided with genuine economic misery. The harvest had failed. Bread prices were impossible. The government had no money and no credibility. In the summer of 1789, the Bastille fell. The French Revolution had begun. What followed was not a single event but a decade of accelerating radicalism. The Declaration of the Rights of Man, the abolition of feudalism, the execution of Louis XIV in January 1793, the Terror, during which the revolutionary government guillotined thousands of its own citizens in the name of protecting the Republic. The revolution consumed its creators with the systematic logic of something that had lost control of itself. The monarchies of Europe watched in alarm and then in horror. Austria, Prussia, Britain, Spain, they formed coalitions to crush the revolution before it spread. France, impossibly, held them off. In the process, it built the largest and most modern army Europe had seen since Rome. Out of that army came Napoleon Bonaparte, a Corsican artillery officer of minor Italian nobility. Napoleon rose through the Revolutionary Wars with a combination of tactical genius, personal magnetism, and breathtaking ambition. By 1799, he had seized control of the French government in a coup. By 1804, he had crowned himself emperor in Notre Dame Cathedral, taking the crown from the Pope's hands and placing it on his own head, a gesture that everyone present understood immediately. He rewrote French law. The Napoleonic Code still forms the basis of legal systems in France, Louisiana, Quebec, and dozens of other places. He reorganized the government, the education system, and the military. He also invaded most of Europe. At his peak, Napoleon controlled territory from Spain to Poland. The old map of Europe had been crumpled up and redrawn. Ancient dynasties were overthrown and replaced by his relatives. The Holy Roman Empire, which had existed in one form or another since Charlemagne, was dissolved. Then he invaded Russia. In 1812, a French army of 600,000 men crossed into Russian territory. Moscow fell, but the Russians refused to negotiate. They burned their own capital rather than let Napoleon use it as a bargaining chip. The French army waited in the ruins through early autumn. The food ran out. Winter arrived. The retreat became a catastrophe, perhaps the single most disastrous military campaign in European history. Of the 600,000 who crossed the border, fewer than 100,000 came back in any condition to fight. The coalition against Napoleon solidified. He was defeated, exiled, escaped, raised another army, and was finally crushed at Waterloo in June 1815. He spent the rest of his life on the remote South Atlantic island of St. Helena. He never left. The 19th century was France's most turbulent domestic century. The restored Bourbon monarchy satisfied almost no one. Revolution returned in 1830, then again in 1848. Between legitimate monarchy, constitutional monarchy, republic, and empire, France cycled through more governments in 50 years than most countries manage in 500. Napoleon's nephew seized power in 1851 and declared himself Napoleon, creating the Second Empire. He modernized Paris. Baron Haussmann's famous boulevards were built during this period, and expanded French colonial holdings in Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. In humiliation. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71 lasted less than a year. Prussian forces besieged Paris. Napoleon III was captured. The Second Empire collapsed. Germany, unified under Prussian leadership during the war itself, emerged as the dominant power in continental Europe. France lost the province of Alsace-Lorraine and paid massive reparations. The Third Republic that followed was chaotic in its politics, but remarkable in its ambitions. France built the second largest colonial empire in the world, stretching across much of sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, and Southeast Asia. It negotiated alliances with Britain and Russia. It built a modern industrial economy, and it nursed its wound, the memory of 1870, the lost province, the humiliation it intended to avenge. In August 1914, that reckoning arrived. The First World War turned the fields of northeastern France into one of the most lethal environments in human history. The trenches ran from the English Channel to the Swiss border. Artillery fired continuously for years. Villages were obliterated so completely that their locations are still marked on maps as villages that died for France. By the time it ended in November 1918, France had lost over 1.5 million soldiers dead, a generation amputated from the population. The victory felt hollow. The reparations imposed on Germany at Versailles satisfied French demands for justice while creating the conditions for the next catastrophe. France spent the 1920s trying to recover and the 1930s trying to avoid another war it could sense coming. In May 1940, Germany attacked through the Ardennes forest. French military planning had assumed any German offensive would repeat the patterns of 1914. It did not. Within 6 weeks, France had collapsed. The armistice was signed in the same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered in 1918. Hitler had it brought from a museum specifically for the occasion. Northern France came under German occupation. The South became the Zone Libre, governed from the spa town of Vichy by the aging Marshal Pétain. The Vichy government collaborated with the Nazi regime, including in the deportation of Jewish citizens to the death camps. But France also resisted. From London, General Charles de Gaulle broadcast defiance on the BBC. The French resistance operated inside the occupied territory. Risky, dangerous work that cost many lives and saved others. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy. Within 2 months, Paris was liberated. By May 1945, the war was over. France, after 1945, was a diminished power trying not to admit it. The Fourth Republic, established in 1946, was plagued by governmental instability. It went through 21 governments in 12 years. The colonial empire was unraveling. A humiliating defeat in Indochina ended in 1954 with France's withdrawal from Vietnam. The Algerian War, which began the same year, was even more traumatic. Algeria had been legally part of France, not merely a colony, and the conflict involved French torture, settler violence, and a crisis that nearly brought the government down. It did bring the Fourth Republic down. In 1958, with France apparently on the verge of civil war over Algeria, a parliamentary resolution invited Charles de Gaulle to return from retirement and take power. He did, on his own terms. The Fifth Republic that de Gaulle created still governs France today. He gave France a strong presidential system and pursued what he called a policy of grandeur, national greatness, independence from both American and Soviet pressure, and a leading role in the construction of a united Europe. France developed its own nuclear weapons. It withdrew from NATO's integrated military command. It recognized the People's Republic of China before most Western nations. It cultivated relationships with former colonies through what became known as France-Afrique, a network of political and economic relationships that France's critics described, often accurately, as neocolonialism. De Gaulle survived a series of assassination attempts, put down an insurrection in Algeria, and won election after election. Then, in May 1968, French students and workers rose in a general strike that paralyzed the country. De Gaulle survived that too? Barely. He resigned the following year after losing a referendum on regional reform. He died in 1970. The decades that followed traced a familiar pattern. Georges Pompidou and Valéry Giscard d'Estaing maintained de Gaulle's essential framework, while France modernized economically. The oil shocks of the 1970s created inflation and unemployment that no government resolved cleanly. In 1981, François Mitterrand became the first socialist president of the Fifth Republic, nationalizing industries and expanding the welfare state before the economic realities of the 1980s forced a retreat toward market policies. Jacques Chirac, who served as president from 1995 to 2007, defined himself largely in opposition to American power, most notably refusing to support the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The decision was popular in France and much of Europe. It permanently damaged the Franco-American relationship for a decade. Nicolas Sarkozy brought a more American-style approach to French politics, energetic, media-conscious, and ultimately mired in controversy. François Hollande, his socialist successor, struggled to define himself against an economy that refused to cooperate. Emmanuel Macron, elected in 2017, represented something genuinely new. A former investment banker who had never run for elected office, he built a movement from scratch, destroyed the traditional left-right division of French politics, and won the presidency at 39. His program? Economically liberal, strongly pro-European, assertive in foreign policy, survived the Gilets-Jaunes protests of 2018-19, the COVID pandemic, and Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Under Macron, France has pushed for deeper European strategic autonomy, maintained its influence in Africa even as anti-French sentiment has grown in the Sahel, and navigated the most dangerous geopolitical moment in Europe since 1945. France began as a collection of tribal peoples on the edge of the Roman world. It became Rome's westernmost province, then Rome's heir, then the most powerful kingdom in Europe, then a revolutionary republic, then an empire, then a republic again. Repeatedly, stubbornly, often chaotically. The thread that runs through all of it is harder to name than to feel. A particular stubbornness, an insistence on being taken seriously. A conviction, sometimes infuriating and sometimes magnificent, that France's story is not simply a national story but a universal one. That what happens in Paris matters to everyone. Whether that conviction is justified is a question every century answers differently. What's certain is that France hasn't finished asking it. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and subscribe to our channel.